So now we're going to be moving on to a little bit more complicated parts of grid. And in this video, we're going to be covering quite a big topic. It's going to be a lot to chew. And don't worry if you don't get it on the first try. We're going to go through this slowly and we're going to go through it step by step so that we can learn everything about this. So in this video, we're going to be learning about the real true power of grid. And what we're going to be learning is how to rearrange and resize items based on starting and ending points. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Now the first thing we need to do is obviously go to our grid container on our HTML file, since we need to specify the start and end points of each item individually. So let's get started. Now the first thing I'm going to do is actually go ahead and remove all of these values, because it'll be much easier to see and understand what's going on when we just have these 5s here. What I'm actually going to do is go ahead and add a 6th item just to break even here and make everything look great. So I'm going to go ahead and choose another color, just something random here, maybe a purple. Do we have that? Yeah, we do have that. Maybe a green, something. Actually, let's just go for a nice dark orange, something here, and we're going to go ahead and copy that. And now we have a 6th value to break even here. So what we're going to be learning in this video is how to, like I just said, resize items. And there are actually a few, there we go, we have our color set up now. We do have a few different shorthands and properties that we can use to set this up. So the first thing we need to learn is the lines and the concept of lines. So we do know that we have our columns and our rows. But what's happening here is that each column starts and ends, or well, each column is designated a certain line. So for example, this would be line 1 at the beginning here, this would be line 2, and then this would be line 3. And then for our rows, we have our line 1 and our line 2. So what we can actually do is set this item to go from line 1 to line 3, and from row line 1 to row line 2. And we can do this using a few properties and some shorthands and some other keywords and other things that we can do to set this whole thing up. So one thing you need to keep in mind that is that lines are basically the core concept, the most important part of grid. It's what makes grid what it is. And all of the properties that we've learned are all kind of revolving around lines and the models created by those lines. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. All right, let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about how to start and end a certain item at a designated area. So we're going to go through and specify these start and end points. Now, there are many different ways to do this, but we're going to start with the basic sort of syntax that we should use to set this up, and then we'll move into some of the more advanced syntax to set this thing up and start creating shorthands and other sorts of properties. So let's go ahead and get started. What I'm going to do is select what item I want. Let's just go ahead and say the first item. And now what we need to do is go ahead and set grid column like this. So what I need to do from here is, to specify a start and an end point, and they are separated by a slash. So the start point is going to be the starting column line, so I'm going to say 1, and the end point is going to be, well, the ending. And I'm just going to say 2, or yeah, I'm going to say 2 or 3 for now. I'm just going to go ahead with 3. Now if I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see what's going on here. Now obviously it looks really weird with all of these different items here, and they're being rearranged in a different way. But what's happening is we're starting at line 1, and then we're going to end at line 3. And you can see that although it's not resizing properly, it still does take up that space in an invisible way. So we have our item 2 at the start of line 3, and everything is pushed right past it, overriding those template rows and columns that we created. Now let's go ahead and specify our next value, which is the grid row value. So what we're going to do here is, just with our first one, we're going to set a start and an end point and separate them by a slash. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and say start at, well, row 1, and we're going to, and we're going to end at, again, let's just go ahead and say line 2, just like this. Now I'm going to refresh the page, and you can see, well, nothing's happened because it does start at 1 and end at 2. Let's go ahead and set 3 right there. So now you can see what's going on here. Although it didn't show anything before where we had 1 to 2 because it already took up that space. When we set it to 1 to 3, you can see that everything has now been pushed again and the space has been separated accordingly. So you can kind of see the power of this already. You can create all sorts of layouts, menus, and sidebars just by using this syntax alone. And it is very powerful, but there's also many different ways to do it, which we're going to be covering over the next few videos. Now, instead of specifying an endpoint or an end line, because these can get quite confusing. You don't know where lines start and where lines end, and it does get quite confusing, especially when you have very big grids with lots of different columns and rows. So instead of this, you can actually specify the distance that you want it to take up. So the keyword that you can use for this is span. What this is going to say is start at some line, whichever one you choose, and span or take up a certain amount of, well, spaces depending on what value you're using. So for now, I'm going to say span 2, and here I'm also going to change this to span 2. Now let's refresh and see what happens. You can see that nothing has changed, of course, because they are exactly the same thing. You start at column 1, and you take up 2 more spaces. You go up 2 more lines. You start at row 1, and then you go down 2 more lines. So you start at line 1, 1, 2, just like that. And this is a much easier way to work with grid columns and rows because you can kind of see what you're doing instead of just specifying start and end points. Like this, you can actually kind of visualize what you're doing with your grids and how big you want to make your items. So that's pretty much it for these different items. Now, there are, like I said, many different shorthands that you can use, which we're going to be learning in just a few videos time. But this is kind of the basic idea of specifying these items. You can go through and you can set start and end points based on the different lines and the sort of model created by the grid, and then you can set how big you want each item to be. All right, let's move on.